Last week, I went over climate anxiety and tips to kind of help you get over climate anxiety. And today, I'm going to talk to you about one of those tips, and that's doing communication, whether it be for climate or whether it be for ocean conservation. We're going to really focus in on ocean conservation because climate is involved in that. But today, I'm going to tell you my tips based on my experience of how to communicate ocean conservation with a little bit of climate on this episode of How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Luen, and this is a podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And today we're going to be talking about taking action because last week I talked about climate anxiety and tips, 3 tips really, to get over climate anxiety or help you sort of face climate anxiety and satisfy what you need to do to get involved for climate anxiety. And that is something that I like to do, is one of those tips, and that is communication, talking about it. One of the reasons why I started my podcast was to get people to talk more about ocean conservation by sharing information that I knew about ocean conservation. So I'm going to go through again why I started to do that, how I did it, some of the successes and challenges, but really just focus on the communication aspect, my strategy when I talk about the content, not just covering the content, but when I talk about it, because I feel like that is something I've been able to excel on as people have been telling me, hey, I really like, Andrew, what you've been able to do with all of this information. I never feel like it's too politicized. I never feel like it's against anybody. I feel like it's nice to get it in easy chunks. All of that wonderful stuff. That's what you, the audience member that I've spoken to, have told me. And so we're going to go over sort of my approach towards this and sort of my overall approach towards the podcast content in this episode. But before I do, I want to talk to you about how I stay focused, because focus is a big thing. And Magic Mind is it's a savior for me. It really is. I was skeptical when I first started to be approached by Magic Mind, and they were like, hey, try this out. You think this could really help you? You do a lot of content, and you must be up all night or up in the morning, early in the mornings, because we know you have a job and all this kind of stuff. We want you to stay focused. We want you to use less of other caffeine drinks that kind of give you spikes and then just drops you even worse than you were before about an hour later. We want you to have this caffeine for a long period of time. So we have this drink that just kind of lets it go a little bit by little bit. And that's the way it needs to be. That's the way you should be. So Magic Mind is the drink for me. It's what I use each and every day. I have a subscription and I love it. I absolutely love it. And I want you to give it a shot. So I asked them to give a deal for you. So it's magicmind.com/protect ocean. And if you go in this checkout, you do protect 20, all one word, protect 20, you get up to 56% off for the next 10 days. So check that out, magicminds.com/protect ocean, and put in protect 20 on at checkout, and you get up to 56% off your next order for the next 10 days. Check that out. This is the last time I'm going to be talking about for a while, so I want you to get access to it as soon as possible. Okay, so let's start talking about communication. I'm going to start from the beginning because some of you haven't heard why I started this and how I started this, but essentially it was because I had all this knowledge on ocean conservation. I had all this knowledge on how climate change was affecting oceans. I had all this knowledge on plastic pollution affecting the ocean. All this knowledge on overfishing affecting the ocean. All of it, right? I talk about it every day to my supervisors, to my classmates at the time, to my colleagues, and to the colleagues that were in marine and freshwater science and conservation. We all knew it. We would go to conferences and we would preach to the choir. I remember one of the conferences where I was like, they're like, yeah, we just come here and preach to the choir. What we need to do is get out more into the communities. We need to get out more into our own communities and be able to talk about that. And that really hit me, going to 2 conferences that I went to, and the call to action was for scientists, practitioners, ocean advocates, ocean activists, to go out to the communities and talk to people, just your immediate circles, family, friends, social media sites at the time where they weren't very big. Excuse me. This was in 2009, 2010. And I started to be like, you know what? I'm going to answer this call. I'm going to try and do something. And as you know, for a lot of you who have, I'm not going to repeat everything that I went through, but I started off blogging, then I went to YouTube channels, then I went podcasting. But every single time I tried to, whatever medium or whatever platform I focus on, that's not the focus of this episode. The focus of this episode is how I approached communication. I thought it was a big deal. Now, and the way I approach communication has to do a lot with my personality, who I am. I am not the smartest person in the room. I am not someone who has all this knowledge and can write, I can just spur off like Latin names of sharks and whales and all these things, invertebrates and things like that. I'm not a taxonomist. I'm not a PhD. I have a master's degree in ocean conservation. I don't talk a lot about education of animals or things like that. My focus and my passion is to talk about ocean conservation. And I do that with the way I speak. I'll be honest, when I was a kid, I didn't read a lot. I read books here and there, and I read books for school, fiction and nonfiction. And throughout my adult life, for a while, I didn't really read that much other than magazines. I'll be honest. Other than like textbooks and journal articles and things like that. But when I got a little older, in my 30s, I started reading a little bit more. Normally nonfiction, business books, entrepreneurial books. As I got more into doing business stuff with this podcast and with this communication, I started to read a little bit more. But for the most part, I'm not very well read. I am, like I said, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I like to talk. I like to speak to people. And my vocabulary is not huge, but it's good enough. And I have this way, I guess it's because of the way I grew up, or the way I didn't read much, or the way like I wasn't a 90s student or anything like that for the most part. Some subjects I was, but not all of them. But I can speak to people. And I have this way about me that I can speak to people. And I'm going to tell you this right now. This is very hard for me to talk about myself and sort of what people have told that I have talent for. I've had many people since I started the podcast say, hey, Andrew, you have this ability to host. Even my day job, I facilitate webinars all the time. I host webinars all the time. I even, started our podcast and launched our podcast and been the host for a podcast for budgeting, which I know really nothing about, public sector budgeting. But I have this ability. And it took me a while to really admit it and see it, but I have this ability to be able to talk to somebody pretty much about anything. And I do it in a very laid back way. You've been listening to this podcast for quite some time now, for the most of you. Some of you who are just discovering, you like my style for some reason. You enjoy the way I just kind of come at it. And I'll be honest, like when I do an article or when I do an episode, I read the article and then I just spew out words. And I will try and tie my experience and my knowledge to that article to try and bring you a little bit extra. But the goal of the podcast is to expose you and make you aware of what's happening in the ocean. I say that every episode. Right? And there are times where I'm ranting. There are times where I take certain articles and I'm like, that doesn't seem right, or that does seem right. But for the most part, I'm making you aware of what's happening in the ocean, and I'm telling you how to deal with it. And so every episode, I try and tell you the same thing, like in terms of the same type of style. Here's the article, here's what I think of it, and here's what I think we need to do with it. And sometimes I'm frustrated, and sometimes I'm not, and sometimes I'm really hopeful and inspired by it, and you can tell that in my voice and the way I speak about it. And I'll probably end up telling you, like, I'm really inspired by this, or this is really making me angry, so I'm going to go on a rant. But for the most part, I'm ready to move forward. I'm ready to go forward and just give you the information. I do it quickly, and I try and do it as succinct as possible, but I do ramble sometimes, just like now. I am rambling. But I enjoy what I do. So I speak to pretty much like a common level. Not to say that scientists are elite, but like a level where people can understand science. I stay away from jargon, right, that scientists really like. I try and make it relatable to everybody as much as I can, right? Or to you, the audience that's listening to this. I sometimes, if I've talked about a subject a lot, I'll refer back to it and I'll say, hey, remember we talked about marine protected areas, and it's something that I really like. So you've probably learned it. If you've been an audience member for a long time, you've probably learned it for quite some time, right? You've probably learned over that time little tidbits of information that I've been giving you about marine protected areas. So when I talk about marine protected areas, it's a little bit more advanced because I really enjoy that type of subject. But I try and make it relatable to everybody so that everybody can understand. I just put it into regular words, in a regular format. Not to make it sound like the audience is, not smart. The idea is to talk to, really, it's my level. It's what it is. I hate to say it. It's my level. It's what I like. It's how I like to discuss things. I will say things like, I will say things like right all the time. And I hear myself every time I edit, but I do this on a casual way because it allows me to put out more information. If I were just putting out, an episode once a month, I would make it super detailed. I have a month to edit it and I'd have stuff to go over, but that's not enough for me. I want to do more. I want to talk about more. So the editing process gets sacrificed a little bit because I put out more information. Sometimes the length is sacrificed a little bit because I put out more information during a week. I'm doing it 3 times a week plus a job, like a full-time job, which this isn't my full-time job, but I spend a lot of time at it. And so I edit the way I feel like I can put out as much information as possible. I also speak in a way where it's like I don't have to spend too much time in prep because I have the knowledge. I've been a scientist and a marine biologist for 20 some odd years. I need to know what I'm talking about when I speak to you. So a lot of the times I look at an article, I'm like, oh, that's pretty interesting. Here are some questions I have. I may do some little bit digging throughout the day, and then I record it at night. And that's how I do my episodes. Very laid back. I really treat it, I think the way I do it, now that I think about it, I really treat it like I treated my first few episodes and how I was describing it to people who were my guests on my first few episodes. My first 12 episodes were published once a week. And they were interviews. They were interviews with people that I knew for quite some time within the marine science and conservation industry, or people that I was connected to. And the reason why I started the podcast is because I had access to all these great people. They were not only colleagues, but they were my friends. And I talked to them quite often. And for me to have the ability to talk to them at a conference or whenever I see them in person or whenever I talk to them online and to be able to discuss the stuff that we discuss, I'm like, this would be really good if people got to listen in on this. And so with podcasting and me understanding how to use podcasting, it was such an easy way to do it, especially when I just did audio podcasts, because people who I spoke to didn't have to worry about how they looked, right? They just had to worry about how they sounded. And for most people, that made them a lot more eased and a lot more comfortable. So like when I was at a conference, they're not talking in front of 20, 30, 40, 400 people. They're just talking to me. Maybe a couple of colleagues were around, the drink table or dinner table, and we're just discussing what's going on in the industry, what's going on in science, and what we need to do. Sometimes there's some complaining and moaning and stuff. But, for the most part, we have some pretty interesting conversations that I think you would enjoy. And so I started to say, hey, let's bring that conversation to the airwaves. Let's bring it to podcasting. And when I approach people to be interviewed, they're like, yeah, that sounds great. What do I have to do? What is a podcast? A lot of them were at the time, but they were like, what do I need to do? And I was like, okay, I'll try and figure it out and then we'll do it. And it's been going great ever since. And then it just kind of evolved into me putting out more solo episodes because I want to get more information out there. And it's really hard to put out interviews every day or every 3 times a week or 5 times a week or 7 days a week. It's very difficult to do interviews that way. Some people do it. John Lee Dumas, if you've ever heard of him, he's a legend in the podcasting industry. He did business interviews every day, but he had his system. So it was always the same questions. It was always the same thing, and he would do it all in one day and then edit them all in another day and then publish them, which is fine, which is great. We all have our own ways. We all have our own approach. And this approach, like for me today, I am literally going off the top of my head. And I have an idea of what I want to talk about, but when you can almost hear once something clicks in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, I need to talk about this, right? So I come in at it from a very laid back point of view, a point of view where I want you to feel like you're at the dinner table or you're at the drink table with us at a conference talking about ocean science and conservation. Sometimes it's great news, sometimes it's horrible news, sometimes it's kind of interesting. right? Or we like geek out about something. I'm like, hey, this is awesome. Like, can you imagine that we caught 2 humpback whales humping? Like, that's pretty damn good. I really enjoy that. It'd be kind of cool that we captured that, and it's never really been captured before. It's never been captured before. And then it was 2 males? Whoo, let's flip it up and put it on its top and let's just see what happens. Like, I mean, that's just amazing. And so we talk about this kind of stuff because it's kind of cool, right? And that's what I do. The other thing, so it's very laid back, try and make it to every level, but really to my level, what I'm comfortable in speaking. So it's not all just, stand up straight or sit up straight and talk like a scientist and use acronyms and this and that and use jargon that you may never understand, because sometimes I'll tell you, I don't even understand. But then I moved to another thing. I really focus in on ocean conservation. There are many other podcasts, amazing podcasts out there that are biology focused, right? That are marine biology focused, that are ocean focused. And they focus a lot on education, educating you about the ocean, but like specific animals, right? Or physiology of animals, or distribution of ecology, like where these animals go and all this kind of stuff. And they're fantastic. They talk to some great people, right? And I just think they're wonderful. But I'm different because I focus on conservation. I focus on how you can tie in your life to the ocean conservation. That's why I changed the name to How to Protect the Ocean. For those of you who didn't know, the name used to be Speak Up for Blue, and then I changed it to Speak Up for the Ocean Blue to try and get some of that search engine optimization, that SEO in there. And then I changed it to How to Protect the Ocean because I felt like this is really, somebody asked me, like, explain what your podcast is about. And I struggled one day. Normally I'm pretty good. I struggled one day and I said, you know what? It's really how you could protect the ocean. That's really what it's about. It's conservation. It's all about ocean conservation. And how can you protect the ocean? So how do you protect the ocean? That's the name of it. I was like, this makes sense. This makes sense. So when people search for oceans, Speak Up for the Ocean Blue is a little bit, I don't know, nuanced maybe. It's not as easy to follow. But How to Protect the Ocean is like, hey man, what do you want to do? I want to know how to protect the ocean. Well, I've got a podcast for you. It's called How to Protect the Ocean. Oh, okay. This is pretty good. I can handle this. This is something good. And I put it in as simple as terms as I can understand. So if I didn't know anything about the ocean and I listened to me, I would be able to understand it because it's from me, right? And I always say this to a lot of people, that if you want to start a podcast, I would not care. I would be happy. I would be happy to support you because I think it's important that we support each other in talking about ocean conservation, because every host, every producer, every person who starts a podcast comes at it from a different angle, especially in ocean conservation, right? Or marine science or marine biology, just in the oceans in general. And that is lovely. I love to hear that, right? I love to hear people trying to get out there and doing something. And so that's the way I approach mine. And there are a lot of other people who keep it very academic. There's some other people who kind of keep it more educational and speak to it more with an educational tone. Some people are just talking to other marine scientists and having a great old time, right? And it just really depends on what is good for you, the audience member. You're listening to this podcast, hopefully because you enjoy my voice, my cadence, the way I speak about things, the way I approach ocean conservation. Hopefully that's why you enjoy it. But there could be another podcast out there that's ocean focused that has another host or hostess, and they are amazing to you. That's what focuses on you. And you love to hear them talk about ocean conservation or ocean science or ocean education, whatever that might be. And that's the beauty of having that diverse options of ocean conservation podcasts or ocean focused podcasts. And I love to see that. But that's the way I approach mine. And to be honest, it's helped me a lot. I am a person who is in Ontario, Canada. I am surrounded by the Great Lakes, but certainly I am not surrounded by the oceans. We call the Great Lakes sweetwater oceans, but they're not salty. They're not an ocean. Some of the processes are the same, but it's very different in the way that it's managed here in Canada and in the US. And so I needed this podcast to satisfy me not being able to work in a full-time job, a traditional 9 to 5, 9 to 10, 9 to whatever that might be, 9 to 9 job in ocean conservation. This is how I stay connected to my friends, my colleagues, right? The ocean conservation community who I've never met before, and I get to meet through this, and I stay abreast on what's going on in the ocean. That's my way of understanding it, right? And staying connected to it. That's the way I love to do things. And it's helped me. It's helped me find the hope and optimism in oceans and in this world. With all the bad things that we've seen, with all the bad things that we've witnessed and that we hear about, man, we can really do some cool things, and we've done some amazing things. There's been some absolute legends out there in the ocean conservation world, and I am so happy to see it. And I get to witness it. I even get to speak to them. Even just the other day, 2 days ago, I published a podcast with the founders of Finstitute, right? Aaliyah and Luca. They are students, graduate students, wanting to help other graduate students get experience, not just for themselves, but other graduate students. Did you hear what I just said? They're not just out for themselves. They're out for all the graduate students at James Cook University in Australia so that they can get as much experience and build a network themselves to work on different projects while they do their master's or PhD project, maybe even an undergraduate project. That's pretty selfless, if you ask me. And that you don't always see that. Actually, you rarely see that within an ocean conservation academic setting. It can be fairly brutal at times. But here they are, two graduate students that are creating these events that allow not only students to intermingle, but it's for students. It's dedicated towards students to build their career. They have career fairs, right? They look at like, hey, have you ever seen a release of the epaulet sharks? Some people haven't even seen epaulet sharks in the person, and now you're seeing a release of them. I mean, that's pretty darn cool. And then you also help raise money for, to buy a tag for the Hugh Project, Madison Stewart's Hugh Project. Like, that's pretty cool. And I just feel as though this podcast and me researching and me being approached by people to be on this podcast and seeing their enthusiasm and sharing their projects makes me happy. It makes me feel optimistic of the future. I'm a small podcast. I don't do this every day. I wish I could, but I don't do this every day. I do this because I love it, and I do it 3 times a week, and I'm very proud of it. I actually end up releasing 5 days a week, but I do it because I'm proud to do this, and I really enjoy doing this. And I think you can enjoy it too if you get into communication and you feel like you have a specific approach that you've always wanted to do. And I know if you're interested in the oceans, you've always wanted to do something. There's always something in the back of the head. Now, it doesn't have to be podcasts. It doesn't have to be, something digital like a YouTube video or short form video on TikTok or Instagram. It could be anything. It could be pretty much whatever you'd like to do. If you want to go to classrooms, if you wanted to do like a community event, if you wanted to do like a beach cleanup, you can come up with your own style, your own way of communicating. It could be local, could be in person, it could be virtual, it could be to one-on-one, it could be one-to-many. It just whatever makes you happy and whatever helps you get over the climate anxiousness and have more climate optimism and have more ocean optimism. Because that's what helps. Just being able to talk to people and approach people in a way where it's non-political, it's bipartisan, right? You want to be able to appeal to as many people as possible, right? And you're able to kind of approach it as like, here's what we see. And then, when people respond, have an open mind when people respond and engage to that message. They may not agree with you fully. Sometimes you may feel like, hey, you know what? Maybe I am wrong and this person's right. Or other times, like, maybe I don't agree with this person, but I can see where they're coming from. And I acknowledge that. It's like, I hear you. I see where you mean. But here's where I think we need to go in the future. You may not agree, and that's fine. And I really appreciate you coming to me and talking to me because you've definitely opened my mind to different perspectives. And I think that's great. That's how I approach people who engage me and may not love the message that I do. I never try and generate hate. I never try and generate split. I always try and generate, some sort of acknowledgement that it's like, hey, you have this perspective and it's really interesting. I may or may not agree with it, but I really like the way you came at it. As long as they're respectful for my ideas and sort of the way I see things. There's always ways around it, and I think that's what's interesting. And if you're waiting for that to stop or you're fearful that that's going to happen, I'm going to tell you it's going to happen. It's going to happen at some point. It may happen a year, 2, 3, 4, 6 months down the road. I don't know. but it's going to happen at some point, and it's how you approach it. You can ignore that person, or you can approach that person, whether it be virtual or in person, and you can just say, hey, yeah, no, I really thank you for bringing it up that point. I don't agree for this reason, but I like the fact that you're thinking from a different perspective and you're thinking about this issue. I think that's really important, right? And go into a way where it's people feel safe and they feel good about themselves for approaching someone like you. Like, it's weird, but when you do a podcast or you do something online that people are watching you each and every day or often enough over the week, you become a little bit of a celebrity in their lives. And so when they see you in person, they might be a little shy, they might be a little excited. It's a weird thing to get over, but I've learned over the years in dealing with people in business as well, like podcasting business and other things, that it's really good to be thankful and to be grateful for the people who have helped you out over time. Right? You may not have gotten it right the first time, but over the time as you evolve in this business of communication, it's really good to acknowledge those people. And to say, hey, I may not have recognized it right off the bat, or may not have shown gratitude enough right off the bat, but there's times where I've been like, man, I really appreciate that person, whether they're a listener or whether they're a colleague or whether they're a friend, and I think that's important to acknowledge, especially when you have somebody who's engaging with you who's not, on your side necessarily. But that's okay. That's why we have podcasting. Everybody has an opinion, and that's okay. And you get to put out your opinion however many times a week and whenever you'd like. And I'll tell you, it's not that hard to start a podcast or a YouTube channel or just start posting on Instagram and on TikTok. And your first video, your first podcast is not going to be your best one. It's probably going to be your worst one because you do get better. I've had over 1,500 of these, and I'm getting better and better, or more comfortable. Maybe not better, but more comfortable with how I say things and where I come from. Right. And I think that's important. That's where you start to get the confidence, and you can share more of the passion, and you can, work on your cadence of your timing of your speech and how you slow things down, how you speed things up. And it's a wonderful process and a wonderful journey, which I think I'll be sharing more. I have a bit of a creative bug to put through, but I'm waiting until I have enough time to start a YouTube channel where I talk about sort of my time podcasting and my time in communication for the ocean. So keep an eye out for that, because that's going to come pretty soon. But anyway, that's it for today's episode. So essentially, you're looking at, I like to do it laid back. I like to make sure that people understand what I'm talking about by speaking to, if I was that person, because I like to speak in this language. And then, of course, being grateful to people and understanding people, and just talking about just what's happening, and I make it really simple editing process, really simple way to do things so I can do things 3 times a week. And that's about it. Okay, so if you have any questions or comments, or you want to start a podcast yourself, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. You can also hit me up on email, via email. I'm not sure how you say that, but on email. Go to speakupforblue.com/podcast. That's not the right one. speakupforblue.com/contact. That's speakupforblue.com/contact. And that's it for today's episode. I really do appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Luen. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.